I'm Adam Forsyth. I'm Head of Research at Longspur Capital. Longspur Capital is our boutique finance house specialising in clean energy. We do corporate finance, both public, private, debt, M&A, project finance. We do investment research, and we also do asset management for institutions who own physical assets.
And you're here at our European CO2 Summit 2025. So just in brief, what were the themes of your presentation?
So we spoke about our experience in financing for both biogas and carbon dioxide. And what we've seen is that the biogas world has been very active. I think in the past 3 years we've seen finance activity rise. We ourselves have closed off a number of projects very successfully. The last one, or one of the biggest ones we did actually, was an interesting play in the biomethane space. The interest there is that actually it had no feedstock contract, so we still found financiers very keen to come and finance the project, despite what has sometimes been seen as one of the risks not necessarily signed off. Now, in fact, actually, it was a very large project, so they had some buyer power, and that made it a little bit easier. But it does tell you how alive that market is for finance. Whereas in contrast, if you look at the carbon dioxide world, much newer space, we have had 2 enormous deals close in the UK. They're very specific to the UK policy background, but otherwise it's a much smaller, less active space. And we're hoping that will develop, of course, over time, but let's see how that plays out.
And maybe slightly revisiting what you've just spoken about there, biogas has of course been a huge theme of this whole event over the last couple of days. So how have you seen that market developing from an investment and a finance point of view?
Well, I think, a good few years ago, the market was seen as really quite small, a lot of small projects, mainly doing biogas, so essentially a mixture of methane and carbon dioxide produced by anaerobic digestion, and being used mainly for CHP, so essentially used just in gas engines to generate power and maybe a bit of heat. What we're now seeing is, one, scaling up, people doing bigger projects, people aggregating smaller projects together, but also, very importantly, more upgrading from biogas to biomethane and producing methane of good enough standard to put in the gas grid. Of course, the beauty about that is you don't need a new logistics system. If you look at the hydrogen world, for example, or other elements of clean energy, you often need transmission, distribution, etc., and all that logistics. It already exists. If you've got methane, it can be injected into the gas grid and then taken out at the end under a mass balancing system. So we're seeing that being reflected in projects coming to the market and also appetite from financiers.
And how does this compare to perhaps some CCS projects too?
CCS is much newer. I think people are less sure about the offtake and also less sure about some of the green credentials, because of course there are different types of CCS. There's biogenic CCS, there's fossil fuel carbon which can then be sequestered, which is a good avoidance technology but not necessarily a carbon removal technology. And I think the market is still looking around a variety of these technologies. We've heard today a lot about direct air capture, which is a newer technology and still maybe slightly expensive, though we think costs will come down. But you have that variety and you have that newness, which I think I think the big thing that we really need to see is policy supporting that. And if policy can support it, and I think that's what we've seen in the UK market, then the financing will come.
And to pick up on that, you said on stage that we have a supportive framework here in the EU, in Europe, in the UK. Perhaps you could tell me a bit about that.
Yes, so what we've seen in the UK is a variety of policies, mainly based around the contract for difference type approach, where the government has sought to support prices rather than necessarily subsidise prices, and support a price which is based on either the voluntary emissions market, where we are seeing credit prices set and a reasonable liquidity in that market, or the ETS, so the emissions trading scheme prices, either the UK ETS scheme or the European ETS scheme. One of the things which we think is quite interesting is there has been some talk of reintegrating the UK scheme back into the European scheme. UK prices have been about half what we've seen in the UK, which is obviously a problem. It's been a much less liquid market. Reintegration would clearly benefit there. But in terms of the policy behind a number of carbon projects, both carbon capture and sequestration, and also bioenergy and carbon capture, as well as waste and other types of carbon capture, we are seeing the UK government stepping up to provide support. Europe Probably the support mechanism is a little bit more grant focused at the moment, but we do see the ECS as critical in that, and we see particular areas such as the Dutch scheme, again a very similar contract for difference type scheme, as being supportive and really helpful and the sort of thing investors like.
Great, and just to touch on e-fuels, one of your fellow panellists up there was here to discuss e-fuels, and this is of course a huge growing market. So how do you see this industry from your investment and financial point of view?
Well, we are already involved in the e-fuels world. We're looking at a project in Spain at the moment, working on a financing there. We're also working on a financing on the transportation of methanol with methanol-fueled vessels. We see methanol as a key decarbonisation solution in shipping. And what's interesting is one of the big drivers of e-fuels, both in aviation and shipping, has been the mandatory blending requirements being brought in both in Europe and elsewhere. And we may, of course, see that go further with the International Maritime Organization, possibly this year bringing in targets as well. That is all driving a need for e-fuels. And I should also say, not just e-fuels, also biogenic fuels, but things like methanol, so either e-methanol or biogenic methanol, and sustainable aviation fuel. And we are seeing real demand out there, and that real demand, of course, then needs projects, and we're beginning to see financing come in for those. Early stage, but we are seeing progress.
Absolutely, and a final question from me, Adam. If you had a message to those watching who might not have been in the room today for your presentation or any of the presentations over the last couple of days, what would your message be?
I think the message is there's still quite a lot that's evolving, but there is opportunity there, and some of it is actually probably more evolved than people think. For example, there's already a valid and viable carbon offtake market in areas like food and drink, and I think that's one of the things I've learned from this conference. That is a bigger market than even I'd expected, and we're seeing that growing. And things like e-fuels come on top of that as well. So there is opportunity. Dig in and have a look, I would say.
Great. Well, Adam, thank you very much for your time.
No problem. Thank you.